Mason had perfected the art of being exactly who everyone expected him to be. Pre-med track, steady girlfriend, family dinners every Sunday where his parents beamed with pride at their accomplished son. Carol was sweet, predictable, and checked every box his mother had ever mentioned in passing comments about the kind of girl he should marry. Their relationship felt safe, like following a well-worn path that led to a future everyone could approve of. But then he walked into that overcrowded house party on a Friday night in October, and everything he thought he knew about himself cracked open like an egg hitting concrete. If this story hits you, drop a heart in the comments. The music was too loud, the air thick with cheap beer and someone's overly enthusiastic cologne. Mason had come with Carol, who immediately disappeared into the kitchen with her sorority sisters, leaving him to navigate the social maze alone. He was contemplating escape when he saw him across the room, a guy with dark hair falling across his forehead, wearing a vintage band t-shirt that somehow looked effortlessly cool instead of trying too hard. The stranger was laughing at something his friend had said, his whole face lighting up with genuine joy, and Mason found himself staring longer than any straight guy should. Their eyes met across the crowded living room, and Mason felt something electric shoot through his chest. The guy, Lucas, he would later learn, didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made Mason's stomach flip in ways that had nothing to do with the beer he'd been nursing. For a moment that stretched like taffy, they just looked at each other, and Mason felt like Lucas could see straight through every carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself. Mason broke eye contact first, his heart hammering against his ribs. He mumbled something about needing air and pushed through the crowd toward the back door, his skin burning with embarrassment and something else he couldn't name. Outside, he leaned against the porch railing and tried to convince himself that whatever had just happened was nothing, just a moment of confusion brought on by too much alcohol and not enough sleep. But Lucas's smile followed him home that night, replaying in his mind as he lay in bed next to Carol, who had fallen asleep immediately after they'd gotten back to her apartment. Mason stared at the ceiling, his girlfriend's soft breathing beside him, and tried to understand why that single moment of eye contact had felt more intimate than anything he'd shared with Carol in their 8 months together. He told himself it was nothing, just a weird moment, a misunderstanding. Maybe Lucas had been looking at someone behind him, or maybe Mason had misread the entire situation. But even as he tried to rationalize it away, he could still feel the ghost of that connection, the way Lucas's eyes had seemed to ask a question Mason wasn't ready to answer. The next morning, Carol made pancakes and chattered about her plans for the weekend, while Mason pushed food around his plate, unable to focus on anything except the memory of dark eyes and an easy smile. When Carol asked if he was feeling okay, he blamed it on too much to drink and promised to take it easy next time. She kissed his forehead and called him sweet, and Mason felt like the worst kind of fraud. For the next 3 days, Mason threw himself into his studies with desperate intensity, as if organic chemistry equations could somehow erase the confusion swirling in his chest. But late at night, when his textbooks were closed and his defenses were down, Lucas's face would surface in his mind like a secret he was keeping from himself. The way he'd looked so comfortable in his own skin, so unapologetically himself, made Mason acutely aware of how much energy he spent every day being what others wanted him to be. For the next 3 days, Mason threw himself into his studies with desperate intensity, as if organic chemistry equations could somehow erase the confusion swirling in his chest. But late at night, when his textbooks were closed and his defenses were down, Lucas's face would surface in his mind like a secret he was keeping from himself. The way he'd looked so comfortable in his own skin, so unapologetically himself, made Mason acutely aware of how much energy he spent every day being what others wanted him to be. Mason had always been good at compartmentalizing his life into neat, manageable sections. Pre-med track, check. Girlfriend who fit perfectly into his family's expectations, check. Social circle that reinforced his carefully constructed identity, check. He'd built his entire existence around meeting other people's definitions of success, and it had worked flawlessly until 3 nights ago when a stranger's smile had somehow managed to crack the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself. Comment below where you're listening from as Mason navigates this unexpected journey of self-discovery. The biology lab on Tuesday morning felt like stepping into a different world. Mason had always found comfort in the sterile environment of science, where everything had clear answers and predictable outcomes. He was early, as usual, setting up his workspace with the methodical precision that had carried him through 2 years of pre-med coursework. The familiar routine of organizing slides and adjusting his microscope should have calmed his racing thoughts, but instead he found himself glancing toward the door every few seconds, his heart performing an irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine. When Lucas walked in, Mason's breath caught in his throat. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the lab, Lucas looked even more striking than he had at the party. His dark hair was slightly tousled, like he'd been running his fingers through it, and he wore a paint-stained hoodie that somehow made him look both artistic and approachable. Mason watched as Lucas scanned the room, his expression shifting from casual observation to something warmer when their eyes met across the lab benches. Mason, right? Lucas approached with that same easy confidence that had captivated Mason at the party. Looks like we're lab partners for the semester. Mason's mouth went dry. He'd completely forgotten about the partnership assignments Professor Chun had announced last week. Yeah, that's great, he managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Lucas slid onto the stool beside him, close enough that Mason could smell his cologne, something warm and woody that made Mason's pulse quicken. I have to admit, I'm grateful to be paired with someone who actually knows what they're doing. Biology isn't exactly my strongest subject. What's your major? Mason asked, though he already suspected the answer based on the paint stains and the way Lucas carried himself with artistic flair. Studio art with a focus on sculpture, Lucas replied, his face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. I know it's not the most practical choice, but I've never been good at pretending to be passionate about things that don't set my soul on fire. The casual way Lucas talked about following his passion made Mason's chest tighten with something that felt like envy. When had Mason last felt passionate about anything beyond meeting expectations? That's really cool, he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. As they worked through their first lab assignment, Mason found himself stealing glances at Lucas's hands as he handled the specimens. His fingers were long and graceful, with small paint stains under his nails that spoke of hours spent creating something beautiful. When Lucas laughed at his own mistake while preparing a slide, the sound was so genuine and unguarded that Mason felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening in a room he'd kept locked for years. So what made you choose pre-med? Lucas asked as they waited for their samples to process. Family pressure or genuine calling? The question was casual, but something in Lucas's tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Mason found himself being more honest than he'd intended. Bit of both, I guess. My dad's a surgeon, my mom's a nurse. It's kind of the family business. That's not really an answer, Lucas said gently, his dark eyes studying Mason's face with an intensity that made Mason feel exposed. What do you want to do? No one had ever asked Mason that question before. Not his parents, not Carol, not even himself. The silence stretched between them, filled with the quiet hum of lab equipment and the distant sound of other students working. Mason realized he didn't have an answer, and that realization was more terrifying than any organic chemistry exam. I don't know, he admitted quietly, the words feeling like a confession. Lucas nodded as if this made perfect sense. That's okay. Most people spend their whole lives pretending they know what they want instead of taking the time to figure it out. The rest of the lab session passed in a blur of shared observations and easy conversation. Mason found himself laughing more than he had in months, drawn to Lucas's quick wit and the way he approached even mundane tasks with curiosity rather than obligation. When Lucas suggested they meet later that week to work on their lab report, Mason agreed faster than he should have, his eagerness betraying him. Walking back to his dorm after class, Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Carol asking about dinner plans. He stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back that he needed to focus on a big project this week. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and Mason was beginning to realize how many half-truths his life was built on. That night, as he lay in bed trying to focus on his biochemistry reading, Mason's mind kept drifting to the way Lucas had looked at him when he'd admitted he didn't know what he wanted. There had been no judgment in those dark eyes, only understanding and something that might have been recognition. For the first time in his life, Mason had felt seen by someone, really seen, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. The next few days blurred together in a haze of stolen glances and manufactured reasons to be near Lucas. Mason found himself arriving at the library early, hoping to catch sight of Lucas's familiar figure hunched over his sketchbook at their usual table. When Lucas would look up and smile, that easy, genuine expression that seemed to light up his entire face, Mason's chest would tighten with something he refused to name. Comment below where you're listening from. Mason thought absently as he watched Lucas explain the intricacies of cellular respiration, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. Mason had stopped listening to the actual words minutes ago, instead focusing on the way Lucas's eyes crinkled when he got excited about a concept, or how he unconsciously tucked a strand of dark hair behind his ear when he was concentrating. Their study sessions had evolved beyond mere academic necessity. What started as twice-weekly meetings for their biology project had somehow become daily occurrences, with Mason inventing increasingly creative excuses for why they needed to spend more time together. He told himself it was just dedication to their grade, but the truth sat heavy in his stomach like a stone he couldn't swallow. "You're really getting this stuff," Lucas said one evening, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. "I was worried you'd think I was a terrible tutor when we started." Mason's heart did something complicated at the praise. "You're not terrible at anything," he said, then immediately felt heat rise in his cheeks. The words had come out more intense than he'd intended, loaded with meaning he wasn't ready to examine. Lucas's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Thanks," he said quietly, and Mason caught the way his gaze lingered a beat too long before he looked away. These moments were becoming more frequent. Charged silences that stretched between them, accidental touches that lasted longer than necessary, conversations that felt like they were dancing around something neither of them dared to name. Mason found himself memorizing Lucas's habits, the way he chewed his pen when he was thinking, how he hummed under his breath while working, the particular laugh he reserved for Mason's terrible science jokes. The jealousy started small, a twist in his stomach when Lucas mentioned grabbing coffee with someone from his art class. But it grew stronger each time Lucas casually referenced other guys, a classmate who'd asked him out, a friend from high school who'd texted him. Mason would feel his jaw clench involuntarily, his hands curling into fists under the table as he fought to keep his expression neutral. "You okay?" Lucas asked one afternoon, catching Mason's reaction when he'd mentioned declining a date with someone from his painting class. "Fine," Mason said quickly, but his voice came out strained. "Just tired." Lucas studied him with those perceptive dark eyes. "You seem tired a lot lately. Maybe you should get some rest instead of staying up late studying every night." But Mason couldn't rest. Sleep had become elusive, his mind too full of Lucas's laugh, the way his shirt rode up slightly when he reached for books on high shelves, the gentle way he'd corrected Mason's pronunciation of scientific terms. Mason would lie awake analyzing every interaction, every shared smile, every moment when their hands had brushed while reaching for the same textbook. Carol had started to notice his distraction. Her calls went unanswered more often than not, and when Mason did pick up, he found himself making excuses to cut conversations short. She'd suggested dinner dates that he'd postponed, movie nights that he'd canceled, all in favor of spending time with Lucas. "I feel like I haven't seen you in weeks," Carol said during one of their brief phone calls, her voice carrying a note of hurt that made Mason's chest ache with guilt. "Are you sure everything's okay? You've been so distant lately." Mason stared at his reflection in his dorm room window, seeing a stranger looking back at him. "I'm just overwhelmed with coursework," he lied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "This biology project is really demanding. Maybe I could help," Carol offered. "I'm good at research." The suggestion sent panic shooting through Mason's veins. The thought of Carol anywhere near Lucas, of his two worlds colliding, felt catastrophic. "No," he said too quickly. "I mean, it's really specialized stuff. My partner and I have a system worked out." After he hung up, Mason sat in the silence of his room, finally allowing himself to acknowledge what he'd been avoiding. He wasn't just drawn to Lucas's friendship or impressed by his academic insights. He was attracted to him. Deeply, undeniably attracted in a way that made his carefully constructed life feel like a house of cards in a windstorm. The realization should have terrified him more than it did. Instead, there was an odd sense of relief, like finally admitting to himself what his body had been trying to tell him for weeks. The way his pulse quickened when Lucas smiled at him, the way he found excuses to sit closer during their study sessions, the way he'd started dreaming about what it might feel like to trace the line of Lucas's jaw with his fingertips. But with recognition came a new kind of torture. Mason became hyper-aware of every interaction, analyzing Lucas's behavior for signs of reciprocated interest. When Lucas's knee bumped against his under the table, was it accidental or intentional? When Lucas complimented his understanding of a concept, was there something warmer in his tone than mere academic approval? The uncertainty was eating him alive. Mason found himself taking longer routes to class just to avoid passing the coffee shop where he might run into Carol. He'd started keeping his phone on silent to avoid her texts, then felt sick with guilt about the growing list of unread messages. His grades in other classes began to slip as he devoted more and more mental energy to analyzing every moment he spent with Lucas. "You're distracted again," Lucas observed during one of their evening study sessions, his voice gentle but concerned. "What's going on with you lately? And don't say you're tired. I know what tired looks like, and this isn't it." Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. Lucas was looking at him with that direct, searching gaze that seemed to see straight through all his carefully maintained facades. For a moment, Mason felt the urge to tell him everything, about the sleepless nights, about the way he'd been avoiding Carol, about the growing certainty that what he felt for Lucas was far beyond friendship. Instead, he looked away, focusing on the scattered notes spread across the table between them. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, and when Mason finally dared to look up, he found Lucas still watching him with an expression that was impossible to read. There was something in his eyes, understanding, maybe, or recognition, that made Mason's breath catch in his throat. "Okay," Lucas said finally, but his tone suggested he didn't believe Mason's denial for a second. "But you know you can talk to me, right? About anything." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and terrifying in its openness. Mason nodded, not trusting his voice, and tried to return his attention to their textbook. But he could feel Lucas's gaze lingering on him, and the weight of all his unspoken feelings pressed against his chest like a physical ache. The textbook pages blurred together as Mason stared at the same paragraph for the 5th time, Lucas's words echoing in his mind. "You can talk to me about anything." The offer felt like a lifeline and a trap all at once, because how could he possibly explain that everything he'd built his life around was crumbling just from being in the same room with him? Lucas had returned to highlighting passages, but Mason could sense the shift in energy between them. The comfortable silence they developed over weeks of studying together now felt charged with unspoken questions. Every time Lucas moved, reaching for his water bottle or adjusting his position on the library chair, Mason found himself hyper-aware of the space between them. "I should probably head back soon," Mason said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Carol's expecting me to call." Lucas's highlighter paused mid-stroke. "Right? Carol." The name came out flat, and Mason caught something in Lucas's expression that made his stomach twist. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." Lucas capped his highlighter with more force than necessary. "Just seems like you've been avoiding her calls a lot lately." Mason's defensive walls shot up instantly. "I haven't been avoiding anything. I've been busy with school, with this project. With me." The words hung between them like an accusation. Mason's mouth went dry. "We're study partners." "That's what study partners do." "Is that what we are?" Lucas asked quietly, finally looking up from his textbook. His brown eyes held a directness that made Mason want to run. "Because sometimes I feel like there's something else happening here, and I can't figure out if I'm imagining it or if you're just really good at pretending it doesn't exist." Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, studying Mason's face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "The way you look at me sometimes, Mason. The way you find excuses to stay later, to meet earlier. The way you tense up whenever I mention dating someone. That's not." Mason started, but Lucas held up a hand. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, but I need to know what's going on here, because this tension is killing me." Lucas's voice dropped lower, more intimate. "If there's something you want to tell me, I'm listening." And if there isn't, then we need to figure out how to go back to just being study partners. Mason felt trapped, cornered by Lucas's honesty and his own desperate need to keep his carefully constructed world intact. There's nothing to tell. Nothing. Lucas's voice carried a note of hurt that made Mason's chest ache. So when you stare at me when you think I'm not looking, that's nothing? When you get that look on your face whenever I mention going out with someone, that's nothing? You're reading too much into things. Am I? Lucas closed his textbook with a soft thud. Because right now, your hands are shaking and you won't look me in the eye. That doesn't seem like nothing. Mason glanced down at his hands, horrified to see Lucas was right. He pressed his palms flat against the table, trying to steady them. I'm fine. No, you're not. Lucas's voice gentled. And that's okay. But lying to me isn't going to make whatever this is go away. The kindness in Lucas's tone almost broke Mason's resolve. He wanted to tell him everything. About the sleepless nights. About the way his heart raced every time Lucas smiled at him. About how being around him felt like coming alive for the first time. But the words stuck in his throat, blocked by years of conditioning and fear. I should go, Mason said, starting to gather his books. Mason, wait. Lucas reached across the table, his fingers brushing Mason's wrist. The contact sent electricity up Mason's arm, and he jerked back as if burned. Don't what? Don't touch you? Don't ask you honest questions? Don't care about what's clearly eating you alive. Lucas's voice rose slightly, drawing a few glances from other students. He lowered it again, but the intensity remained. I'm trying to be your friend here, but you won't let me. We are friends, Mason said weakly. Friends don't lie to each other like this. Lucas stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. And they don't look at each other the way you've been looking at me. Mason's face burned. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Lucas moved around the table, and suddenly he was standing right beside Mason's chair. You look at me like you're drowning, and I'm the only person who can save you. And then you pretend it never happened. Mason's breath caught. Lucas was close enough that he could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Lucas, please. Please what? Please stop noticing. Please stop caring. Lucas's voice was barely above a whisper now. Because I can't do either of those things. Not anymore. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Mason felt his carefully built defenses crumbling, but panic rose in their place. I can't do this. Can't do what? Can't be honest? Can't admit that there's something between us. There's nothing between us. Mason's voice cracked on the words. Lucas stepped back as if Mason had slapped him. Right? Of course there isn't. His expression shuddered, the warmth disappearing from his eyes. I'm sorry I misread the situation. He turned to go, and something desperate clawed at Mason's chest. The thought of Lucas walking away, of losing whatever fragile connection they'd built, was unbearable. Without thinking, Mason shot up from his chair and grabbed Lucas's wrist. Wait. Lucas froze, looking down at Mason's hand wrapped around his wrist. When he looked back up, his expression was guarded but hopeful. What? Mason's mouth opened, but no words came. He was acutely aware of his hand on Lucas's skin, of the way Lucas's pulse jumped beneath his fingers. They stood there in the quiet corner of the library, surrounded by the soft sounds of turning pages and whispered conversations. But Mason felt like they were the only two people in the world. Mason, Lucas said softly, and his name on Lucas's lips sounded like a prayer. Mason's grip tightened involuntarily. He could feel Lucas's warmth, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. The space between them felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mason started, but the words died in his throat. Lucas took a small step closer, and suddenly they were standing inches apart, Mason's hand still wrapped around Lucas's wrist. Mason could feel the heat radiating from Lucas's body, could see the way his eyes had darkened with something that looked like hope mixed with fear. Tell me, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Tell me what you're thinking. Mason's heart pounded so hard, he was sure Lucas could hear it. The truth sat on the tip of his tongue, terrifying and liberating all at once. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and unspoken confessions, while Mason stood frozen between the life he'd always known and the one he was too afraid to reach for. I stared at Lucas for what felt like an eternity, my hand still wrapped around his wrist, feeling his pulse racing beneath my fingertips. The weight of everything unsaid pressed down on us both, and I could see the hurt in his eyes slowly giving way to something else. Hope, maybe, or recognition of what we both knew was true. "Mason," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet study room. I released his wrist like I'd been burned, stepping back so quickly I nearly knocked over my chair. I should go." The words tumbled out before I could stop them, and I grabbed my backpack with shaking hands. Lucas didn't try to stop me this time. He just watched as I fled, and somehow that was worse than if he'd called after me. The next 3 hours were torture. I sat in my dorm room, staring at my biology textbook without reading a single word, while my roommate played video games with his headphones on. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text Lucas, then pull my hand back like the device was on fire. Comment below where you're listening from, because right now, I felt completely alone in the world. Carol called twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. By 11 p.m., I was pacing my small room like a caged animal. The walls felt like they were closing in, and every breath seemed harder than the last. I kept replaying the moment Lucas had asked me directly about my feelings, the way his voice had been so gentle, so understanding, even when he was clearly hurt by my denial. He'd been brave enough to confront the truth, and I'd been a coward. At 11:47 p.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my roommate barely glancing up as I left. The campus was mostly quiet, just a few students walking back from late study sessions or weekend parties. The October air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I walked across the quad toward Lucas's dorm. I'd never been to his room before. We'd always met in the library or study rooms, but I'd memorized his address from the class roster weeks ago, though I'd never admitted that to myself until now. The building was one of the newer ones, with key card access, and I stood outside for 10 minutes trying to work up the courage to call him. My hands were shaking as I dialed his number. "Mason." His voice was cautious, surprised. "It's almost midnight." "I know. I'm outside your dorm. Can you let me in?" There was a pause that felt like forever. "Building entrance, or my room?" "Building. I need to see you. Give me 2 minutes." When Lucas appeared at the glass doors, he was wearing an oversized hoodie and pajama pants, his hair messy like he'd been lying down. He looked tired, and I realized with a stab of guilt that I'd probably kept him awake too. He swiped his key card and held the door open for me, neither of us speaking as we walked to the elevator. The silence wasn't comfortable like it usually was between us. It was loaded with everything we hadn't said, everything I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. His room was on the 4th floor, and when he unlocked the door, I saw it was exactly what I'd imagined. Art supplies scattered across his desk, a half-finished painting on an easel by the window, books stacked in neat piles on his nightstand. It smelled like acrylic paint and the cologne he always wore, something clean and warm that made my chest tight. "So," he said, closing the door behind us and leaning against it. "You're here." I stood in the middle of his room, suddenly aware of how intimate this was, being in his personal space, seeing where he slept, surrounded by all the things that made him who he was. My heart was racing again, but this time it wasn't just from fear. "I couldn't sleep," I said, which was true, but nowhere near the whole truth. "Neither could I." He crossed his arms, studying my face. "You want to tell me what's really going on, Mason? Because that thing earlier in the study room." I lied. I blurted out, the words escaping before I could stop them. "When you asked if I had feelings for you, I lied." Lucas went very still. "Okay. I've been lying to myself for weeks. Maybe longer." I ran my hands through my hair, pacing to his window and back. "I can't stop thinking about you. I make up excuses to see you. I get jealous when you mention other guys. And I've been avoiding Carol because being with her feels like I'm betraying something I can't even name." "Mason, I'm terrified," I continued, the words pouring out now that I'd started. "I've never felt this way about anyone, and I don't know what it means or what I'm supposed to do with it. My family has these expectations, and I've spent my whole life trying to be what they want me to be, but then you smile at me, and suddenly none of that matters." I stopped pacing and looked at him directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "Being around you makes me feel more alive than I've ever felt. Like I'm finally awake after sleepwalking through my entire life. And that scares the hell out of me, because I don't know how to be this person." Lucas pushed off from the door, taking a step toward me. "What person?" "Someone who I swallowed hard. Someone who has feelings for his male lab partner. Someone who lies awake at night thinking about what it would be like to kiss you. Someone who's been pretending to be straight because it was easier than admitting the truth. The admission hung between us, raw and honest and terrifying. Lucas's eyes never left mine, and I could see him processing everything I'd just said. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "That's the thing. I think part of me has always known. But I've been so good at pushing it down, at convincing myself it was just friendship or admiration or whatever else I could call it." I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Then I met you, and suddenly I couldn't pretend anymore." Lucas took another step closer. "You know I'm not going anywhere, right? Whatever this is, whatever you're feeling, you don't have to figure it out alone." "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "I don't know how to be honest about who I am when I'm still trying to figure it out myself." "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "One day at a time." I felt something break open in my chest, not painful, but like a dam finally giving way. All the fear and confusion and desperate longing I'd been carrying for weeks came rushing out, and I realized I was crying. "I'm sorry," I said, wiping at my eyes. "I'm sorry I lied to you earlier. I'm sorry I've been such a mess." "Hey." Lucas reached out, his fingers brushing mine. "You're not a mess. You're brave. It takes courage to admit the truth, especially when it changes everything." I looked down at our hands, the simple contact sending warmth up my arm. "I don't feel brave. Trust me," he said, and when I looked up, his smile was soft and understanding. "You are." The silence stretched between us, filled with everything I'd finally said and everything I still couldn't quite believe I'd admitted. Lucas's thumb traced gentle circles across my knuckles, and I found myself focusing on that small gesture, anchoring myself to this moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "Mason," he said quietly, and something in his voice made me look up. His eyes were searching mine, and I saw something there I'd been too afraid to recognize before, hope mixed with careful restraint. "I need you to know something." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I've been waiting," he continued, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from my forehead. "Not just tonight, but for weeks. Waiting for you to see what I've been seeing, waiting for you to be ready to admit what's been happening between us." My breath caught. "Lucas, let me finish," he said gently. "I've watched you fight this, watched you tie yourself in knots trying to pretend you don't feel what I know you feel. And I've been patient because I could see how scared you were, how much you were struggling with it." The honesty in his voice made my chest tight. "I'm still scared," I whispered. "I know." His hand moved to cup my cheek, and I leaned into the touch without thinking. "But you're here. You came to me. You told me the truth, and that took incredible courage." I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his palm against my skin. "I've never felt this way about anyone," I admitted, the words barely audible. "Not Carol, not anyone. When I'm with you, it's like I can finally breathe properly for the first time in my life." When I opened my eyes, Lucas was looking at me with such tenderness that it made my heart race. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. I nodded. "Can I kiss you?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt my whole world shift on its axis. This was it, the moment that would change everything, that would make all of this real in a way that talking couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Yes," I breathed, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was everything I'd been afraid to imagine and more. It was desperate and tender at the same time, filled with weeks of suppressed longing and the relief of finally giving in. I found myself clinging to him, my hands fisting in his shirt as if he might disappear if I let go. He kissed me like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment, like I was something precious he'd finally been allowed to hold. When we broke apart, I was shaking. The reality of what had just happened hit me all at once. The softness of his lips, the way he'd held me like I mattered, the fact that kissing him felt more right than anything I'd ever done in my life. The emotions I'd been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface, and before I could stop myself, I was crying. "Hey," Lucas whispered, pulling me against his chest. "It's okay. You're okay." But I couldn't stop. All the fear, the confusion, the years of pretending to be someone I wasn't, it all came pouring out. "I've been waiting my whole life to feel this connected to someone." I sobbed against his shoulder. "I didn't even know it was possible to feel this way." Lucas held me tighter, his hand stroking my back. "I know," he murmured. "I know, and it's going to be okay." We're going to figure this out together. I pulled back to look at him, tears still streaming down my face. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be who I really am. One day at a time, he said, echoing his earlier words. We'll take it one day at a time. 3 weeks later, I'm sitting across from Lucas in our usual corner booth at the campus coffee shop, watching him sketch in the margins of his biology notes. The morning light catches the gold in his hair, and I still can't believe I'm allowed to notice things like that now. To reach across the table and brush my fingers against his hand when he looks up at me with that soft smile. You're staring again, he says, not looking up from his drawing. Can't help it. The words come easier now, though my heart still speeds up when I say them out loud. Breaking up with Carol was harder than I expected, not because I loved her, but because it meant admitting I'd been living a lie. She deserved better than someone who was using her to hide from himself. She cried, asked if there was someone else, and I told her the truth. She said she'd suspected something was different these past few weeks. My parents are next. Lucas knows I'm not ready yet, and he doesn't push. He just holds my hand under the table when I mention them, a silent reminder that I'm not facing this alone. I talked to my mom last night. I tell him now, watching his pencil still against the paper. He looks up, eyebrows raised. And I told her I wanted to bring someone home for dinner next weekend. I take a shaky breath. Someone important. Lucas sets down his pencil, reaches across to cover my hand with both of his. Are you sure? I nod, thinking about how 3 weeks ago I couldn't even admit to myself what I felt for him. Now I'm planning to introduce him to my family. I'm tired of hiding who I am. Tired of pretending this isn't the most real thing in my life. He brings my hand to his lips, presses a gentle kiss to my knuckles. One day at a time, remember? One day at a time, I repeat, and for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of tomorrow.